Jarrad Holst, attorney, history lover, political junkie, real estate developer, and my favorite, LinkedIn truth bomb dropper. Our conversation dips and dives in and out of current events, the 2024 election, St. Louis city politics, regional politics, historical equivalencies to today's madness, and my favorite part, his brilliant idea regarding the hot topic of how to spend the Rams' money here in the Lou. Thanks for listening, and be sure to subscribe to the show on your favorite pod platform or go check out our YouTube channel. Let's go. Last name?
Holst.
Holst. Got it.
Yeah.
Easy.
Yeah. Quite German.
A little bit.
Yeah.
I wasn't gonna guess Italian. So I'll be honest, Jarrad. Part of the reason I reached out was intrigue. Like everybody else in today's world, it's all social media trolling.
Oh yeah.
I mean research.
Yeah.
Our circles, our connection crossed paths via the Gen X platform, i.e. LinkedIn. And I'm sorry if I offended you if you're not quite an Xer, because it looks like you might be on the bubble.
I am on the border. So my birthday was yesterday, December 1st, 1979. So I think I'm just creeping into the tail end of Gen X.
So the cool stuff is the X side, and the stuff that you like, man, I need to improve upon, that's the millennial in you?
Oh yeah. Well, I'm happy to be a part of Gen X because the 80s and 90s were phenomenal for music. And
Yeah.
I think it's gone downhill precipitously since then.
Yeah, no kidding. So there was a couple things that drew me to reaching out. Number one, is you seem to regularly engage a lot of City of St. Louis posts, development posts, that gray area also of like political business, the Venn diagram of St. Louis politics and development and business. I see the little profile pic flying around on those. And then recently, I've noticed more long form posts, opinions that seem to be, again, more in line with maybe your likes or your follows that aren't necessarily what would appear to be your day job. It's not just law. It's not just real estate. It's just not. It's not just banking. Because if you read your resume, it's like those are the things that technically on paper you specialize in. So my simple question is, what's the fun part for you? What are you really looking at on LinkedIn? Like, because everybody's drawn to a certain engagement on their social platforms. What's your trigger, so to speak?
So my trigger would be, I was diagnosed with ADHD in the second grade. They actually brought me into a classroom at Westchester Elementary in Kirkwood. And I remember them sitting me down and they're like, Jarrad, your test scores are really, really bad. And you have kind of two paths you can take here. You can either go into the special school district's resource program, that's here at Westchester, or we can put you permanently into the special school district school off of Ballas in Clayton. And my mind has always jumped around to different topics, whatever I find interesting. And that's the way that your mind works when you have ADHD. It's like you're on this constant shuffle button on your music player where, you hear a song and then you click on the next thing, you click on the next thing, click on the next thing. And so, if you were to look at the music that I listen to, it's literally like every type of genre, Spanish, French, obviously English, and then
no grunge,
hip hop, grunge. I mean, yeah, I listen to all of it.
Grunge, right?
And so the way that, I decide what to post about, I look at I don't really follow what's trending, so to speak. I look at what speaks to me. Very similar to how an artist decides whether to paint something or not, or how a musician decides whether to sing or play something or not. And when I have something that speaks to me, then I decide to write about it. I don't write about every single time, there's a positive or a negative thing that happens in St. Louis. I look at something from, my standpoint. I just said, does this speak to me? And then what can I say to viewers, that can engage them into this topic, can inform them on this topic, and then allow them to have a discussion about it, which I think is an educated discussion about it, which I think is so lacking today in social media.
Well, I think I completely agree. And where I would add to that, just my own 2 cents, in reading your post, it's almost as if it's a little bit of a cry in so much that the lack of facts, the lack of data, the lack of accepting metrics as reality has completely kind of infected conversations or lack thereof, right? So, for example, the fentanyl post the other day.
Mm-hmm.
At first, I was like, okay, I was assuming it was going to be some tariff / pseudo political / we're going to, let's get to the root cause of fentanyl. And to a degree, you did. And you created this Venn diagram of cash, not just the money in fentanyl, like just from a superfluous viewpoint, but literally like $50 bills and $100 bills are the problem because $1 million in cash is 22 pounds. And explain why, what drew you to taking that particular subject matter, the influx of fentanyl and the money associated with it, but you really broke it into this like granular level that was the physical component of cash. Why? What was the trigger there?
Well, so how I lay a lot of the post out is what I was taught in law school, which is called the CRAC method. So it's CRAC. And what that acronym stands for is conclusion, rule, application, and conclusion. And so you'll notice that I always start off with a conclusion, what this post is going to be about and what my beliefs are about. Then I set forth the data, then I set forth an application of those rules to that data, and then I restate my conclusion again at the very end. In taking on a particular topic like fentanyl, that's one of the reasons why, Trump is proposing a 25%, tariff increase to Mexico, is that he wants to stop the influx of fentanyl coming in from across their borders. I think one of the problems that I have when people look at these, major issues that affect our society is that they complicate them too much.
Yep.
And Thomas Jefferson once said that the hardest thing to do, and I'm paraphrasing it, is to write a short letter. And it really is. It's very, very hard to simplify things. And so what we do is we overcomplicate it. We throw a lot of bureaucracy at it. And then the issue kind of gets kicked down the road, like a can, and it never really gets solved. And I look at issues with a lot more simplicity, very similar to
Sure.
The fact that, both of my parents grew up on farms. I grew up around farmers. And they just have a very simplistic, common sense way of how they approach problems. And so when I look at, the fentanyl issue in particular, it's all about money. I mean, that's how that runs.
Well, I believe it was in this post where you pointed out the simplicity and the reality of fentanyl is not unique to, a particular region of the world because it's a manufactured substance.
Yeah.
So with, a certain amount of money and a YouTube feed, you can actually become a fentanyl producer, with obviously the ingredients, so to speak. No different than Oklahoma City bombing, right? Any of these things, a bomb or a drug.
Well, and if it's not, fentanyl, you could go back, a couple decades ago and it was coke and it was heroin.
Sure.
You could go back a couple decades before that and it was pot. I mean, you can close off one avenue to a drug, or another, drug might become legal, and then another drug will become popular again. My point is that demand part is not going to stop unless you go after the money, unless you go after the incentive as to why those dealers and cartels do that.
Yeah. So root cause. You alluded to it earlier. Um, I tend to believe that is one of the areas in which nobody ever pays attention to it. For example, if we want to talk about obesity in America, right? Everybody wants to jump to the top and go to fast food, or they want to go to whatever the easy low-hanging fruit to say, well, that creates fat people, but if you back it out to the ability for lower income or middle class families to buy healthier food or organic food whenever a kid is 3, 4, 5 years old and it becomes habit, right? To me, that's more of a root cause issue. But when it comes to these subject matters, such as drugs, drug use, or food, or whatever it is, gun crimes, right? Well, everybody's crazy. Okay, well, the root cause of people being crazy might be a lack of healthcare. When you approach this, is it the lawyer in you, where it's all a bigger case, so to speak, in which you want to get to root cause?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things that I love about the law is that there's finality in it. The law is one of the few places where you can force people to take responsibility, and you can't come into a court and just spread off an opinion. It doesn't matter to the court. You might have a theory as to, why your client should be either found this way or that way. Mm-hmm. But at the end of the day, you still have to back it up with facts and evidence. And if you don't have facts and evidence, it's never going to fly. So, I mean, an example on that, just to touch on this, when you had the allegations of voter fraud that came out post 2020,
right?
You had a number of different cases. I think there were over 50 different cases that came before federal judges where you had lawyers arguing voter fraud. And it never advanced past the initial stages because when a lawyer goes to court, a lawyer can't lie to that judge. They can't do that. We'll lose our license if we do it. We also can't present false testimony or false evidence. We can't do that either. If we know that it's false and we know that it's...
wasn't that the pushback on the election cases, was that there was a number of evidence items that were intended to be presented that would have helped the opposing party's case, but were never admitted.
Yeah. So the judge is going to say, "Do you have evidence of voter fraud?
Sure.
Can you say this right now in front of me?" And there wasn't a single lawyer that could do it. And because of that, the judge is going to look at it and say, "Look, the facts, the evidence, and the law isn't on your side. We can't go past this point," and that's why none of those cases advanced there. And so
to simplify it, though, as a layman that is not an attorney but had read so many of those articles, because I'm a nerd about that, what you're saying is that they claimed to have evidence, but they weren't willing to say there was voter fraud. Therefore, the judges said you can't submit. If you can't say that you have enough to prove it is, you can't submit stuff that might. Is that your interpretation of?
Well, my interpretation of it is, lawyers are making representations before the court, and they can't come out and say voter fraud was committed in this case if they have no evidence and no testimony to back it up. It can't just be mere speculation. It can't be mere opinion. Like, you have to have hard evidence, hard facts to back it up. And that's the way that when you see how I lay out posts, I do a lot of research before, I post things on there. And then the comments that I, have when I respond to people with things. And that's probably one of the most frustrating things that I guess people have when they're having a discussion with me, is that I'm prepared. I'm always ready for these counter arguments to come into play. And either you have the facts and evidence to back up what your opinion is stating, or it doesn't mean anything.
How does it make you feel that, quote, fake news kind of originated circa 2015 and its effect that it's having on these types of discussions, especially for an individual like yourself that is data-driven? When you do run into the buzzsaw of a I'll put it politely, maybe a troll on socials that is just purely spewing that's fake news. Not providing any contradictory evidence or validation from a reliable source. How does it make you feel that your whole career, your life, for lack of a better word, there is about facts and process, but we're now dealing in conversations in which we can't even agree on what is empirically true? How do you approach that environment?
Well, it's humanity, though. I mean, humans have been doing this since the beginning of time in terms of using propaganda to push a certain viewpoint that might be true, it might be false. And an example of that, in this country is the Boston Massacre. So there's a famous lithograph that Paul Revere drew up, and you see this plume of smoke and these guns going off, and then all these colonists laying on the ground and blood coming out of them. And this was pushed in all the publications throughout the 13 colonies. Is like, that's what happened with the Boston Massacre, okay?
Right.
Everything about that lithograph is absolutely false. And it was proven because more than, I think it was either, there was 8 or 9 of those soldiers that were put on trial in Boston by a Boston jury. John Adams, the future second president of the United States, represented them, got 8 out of the 9 soldiers that were, indicted, got him off, not guilty, by a Boston jury.
Right.
Because he had an opportunity to put evidence in front of them. And he said, not only to this Boston jury, but just in general to the country, if we are going to have a country, we have to have rule of law. We have to have common sense. We can't just...
Do you think we have common sense right now in totality in our society?
I think we do. I think people get lazy sometimes when it comes to the news, And once again, this wasn't just with, the precursor to the Revolutionary War. We did this, prior to the Spanish-American War happening. You had these publications that were being pushed by Pulitzer and by William Randolph Hearst. So that was kind of like the Fox News and CNN of the day, back in the late 19th century.
Right.
And there was this ship that blew up in Havana Harbor, and it killed all these soldiers on board, and they blamed it on Spain. And then they used that as a precursor to have the Spanish-American War. None of that was true. Every study under the sun, including by the U.S. Navy, has shown that the USS Maine blew up on its own accord because of faulty air, on the sailor's part, not because of anything that Spain did or Cuba did. So this has been going on since the beginning of our country. I think as citizens, we have a responsibility to listen to all the different sides, do a little bit of research on our own, and then come up with an opinion, but that is rooted in facts and evidence, not just an opinion because we're regurgitating what somebody told us on a Fox News or a CNN.
Well, but how does facts? Let me give you an example, a hypothetical example. If you have an econ professor from the University of Michigan, just to pick a school, that has done 7 years of research proving inflationary theory as it pertains to groceries in particular, and has since taken everything post-COVID and has laid it out and says, definitively after all this research, here's what we see. Presidents have, 17% of the responsibility. Global trade has 38%, and you add it all up. This is what the numbers say, right? But they only have 700 followers on Twitter, right? And they put out this definitive information. And then you have this compare and contrast where you have some, has been, World of Warfare junkie who's got, 2 million streamers that follow him on YouTube, comes out and says, that's not how this works. Here's how it really works. It's 92% Biden's fault and 6% China and whatever.
Yeah.
How do you view that warfare for common sense to break through when you have this data that is being fed to us through channels that are artificially inflated simply by popularity? by views, by subscribers, without any real correlation to experience, knowledge, or data.
Once again, we've had that throughout U.S. history. You've had, I guess, demigods, as you would call them, come along that had...
That's a polite way of putting it.
that had, a fervent, following, so to speak, and people believed everything that they said as gospel. But eventually it hits. Eventually, it's kind of like the issue of slavery. Eventually you look at it from a common sense perspective and you go, you know what? I know you're telling me that this is allowed in the Bible, or, it's good for our economy, or whatever you want to say it. But I'm looking at it right now and it's wrong. You can't put people in chains. You can't force them into labor.
Right.
And so I think eventually, you can try to convince people until you're red in the face that, in December right now in St. Louis, it's 80 degrees outside. But eventually you're going to step outside and go, oh shit, it's cold out. It's snowing today.
Yeah.
It isn't that temperature. And so I think eventually, Abraham Lincoln had a great line one time. He said, you can fool some people some of the time, but you can't fool all the people all the time. And I think, part of the country has been fooled on things before, and it took a while for that to catch up. But then when it, to your question on inflation, I think when it eventually really starts hitting you in the pocketbook, and then you look at the people that are leading you, and you look at the fact that your community is not progressing, you finally come to the realization, hey, I've been sold, some snake oil here. This isn't correct. I need to pivot.
How do you, when you zoom out, because obviously you're politically interested at a minimum, you're active to a degree in how you post. When you zoom out, specifically in the case of economics, I always look at the macro cases where you can see, the data that's there for states that thrive, or maybe municipalities that thrive, but really states is an easy one because everybody wants to look at that red and blue map. Oh, look, we're a red country, and and then there's always, and I love sharing the one where it's like, no, let's do the population centers because land doesn't vote, right? So there's blue and red dots, and then a whole bunch of white, for land. When you look at, say, I don't care what the metric is, quality of life, healthcare outcomes, median income, median house, educational output, test scores, etc. How do you take that data in when chart after chart after chart shows repeatedly that the bottom 10 are typically 90% supermajority red, the top 10 are usually blue or shades of blue, but there's definitively not a supermajority red state that's in the top 10 whenever you take in totality quality of life, education, income, etc. Do you view our country through some of those lenses where it's like, if we need a case study, right? If we need to feed our own bias, at some point there has to be numbers or proof to validate our bias. But it feels as if we're not really looking at any of the data, because if we do value healthcare, if we do value education, and all these things that everybody claims that they have the mantle on, well, we're really not looking at the states that do it right. We're looking at it more through a theoretical lens. Do you see it that way? Do you see some disconnect between outcomes and theory?
I don't know if I would call it a disconnect. I would call it a delay. I think one of the biggest problems that people have when they make certain arguments is they think, because of all this data, and it's kind of like the book, What's Wrong with Kansas? Why do they continue to vote that way? But I think people are looking at it the wrong way because, number one, you're probably, if you've got a college education, you're in the upper percentile of the country in terms of, your education. And then you've been kind of in that bubble for most of your life, surrounding yourself with other educated people. Mm-hmm. And it's very difficult for you then to understand what other people are going through and how they feel about, certain policies or what their community is like or what it's going through. And so, I think that, when you look at those communities, especially rural communities or red state communities, And you might think, oh, they're stuck in this one view and they're never going to get out of it. And I disagree with that. I just think in certain communities, it takes a little longer for things to hit home. But when it finally does, they immediately flip a switch and they will go, to the other side of the table, so to speak. And so during the 1920s, most of the 1920s, the country predominantly voted Republican. Okay, Hardin and Coolidge and then Hoover at the end of the decade. Right. That party drove they had the Roaring '20s, but then you had deregulation, and then they drove the country into the ground.
Great Depression.
To the Great Depression. And that brought about FDR, Franklin Roosevelt. And think about that for a moment. This is a guy that's coming from a really wealthy background. New York, is bound to a wheelchair. The press knows it. But people are so desperate for help. There's 25% unemployment. There's all these soup kitchen lines.
Right.
People need help. So who do they turn to? They turn to him and say, fix this. And then he stays in power for another, I think, 11 or 12 years, okay? They keep voting him back in overwhelmingly. You have all this regulation that gets passed. And people finally start to see, oh, this is how we need to vote. This is how things need to change.
Yeah.
And that's why you had the Democratic Party dominated the blue-collar sector all the way up until the 90s. That was in their back pocket. But it's because they spoke to them with their policy. And those people, in those communities felt it. And I think you got to touch on it again, during the Great Recession, right when that started, in 2007 and then, crescendoed in 2008 and 2009.
Right.
You had a black guy running for office, Barack Obama. And this guy was winning in states that if you told me he would have won in those states a couple years ago, I would have been like, not a chance. But guess what? People saw double-digit unemployment. People saw stock markets tanking. People saw factories closing and moving, out of the country.
Right.
And they said, you know what? These policies from the Republican Party are not working. We need to pivot. And so I don't think that giant is necessarily gone away. I just think that it's asleep sometimes, and you have to have the right politician come along. You have to have the right set of economic circumstances come along to awaken it again and turn, to a direction where I think those policies could help them.
All right, we're back. I want to ask a quick follow-up question, because you pointed out the 20s under Republican rule for a number of years, the Roaring '20s leading to a Great Depression. We had two recessions towards the end of the 80s following Reagan, deregulation, et cetera, and Bush compounding on top of it. Enter Clinton, again, a big swing the other way. Balanced budget, deficit reduction, surplus, all this other stuff goes all the way. Now, we see a swing away from Clinton, Gore, right, into Bush again. Maybe on the coattails of NAFTA, and kind of like, well, what about us first? Because obviously that was the big talking point at the time. And you had the .com rush that was really kind of shaking trees, moving the money around at the political elite level. You go into the 2000s, and we have 9/11, and then we have just an absolute explosion of spending to support these wars, et cetera, leading us to the 07, 08, massive recession. In comes Obama, who's the exact opposite of, what you had just described, of what we had. But I'm so intrigued by what has just happened, because the Obama years, for all intent and purposes, recovered, saved the economy, full employment, Fed fund rates were, towards the end, basically zero, right? And all of that tailed into Trump won. Trump, quote, won. There was a swing the other way, and people didn't want Hillary. I think that's really what came down to in hindsight, looking back. And also you had the first generation that grew up with this reality TV star. He was more popular in more living rooms than any of the other potential candidates, right? COVID hits at the end of his run. Everything gets blown up. We're back up at 14% unemployment, starts to fall following. We have this explosion in debt. The deficit spending was completely out of control. So everybody wants to swing the other way to fix that. For all intent and purposes, when it comes to the economy, what Joe Biden and his administration did was fix the economy. The sticky point was pricing, not inflation, because inflation dropped, right? Inflation was dropping. The stock market hitting record after record after record. You're in real estate. You saw what I saw. The valuations continue to go up. For the most part, the macro parts of the market not only recovered from COVID, but accelerated, and we're hitting points above, including energy production, right? Everybody's heard the words, right? They claim drill, baby, drill, and the Democrats poorly said we're record-breaking drillers right now, right? So it seemed as if everything was going in the right direction, but there was a massive swing the other way. I would argue that it was way more than economics, because on paper, if anybody was really honest with themselves at the end of the Biden 4 years, which we're at now, they're looking at their 401k statement. They're looking at anything of value, of equity, and they have more. They have exponentially more than they've ever had. But that wasn't enough. How do you view, what was the impetus? What was the item, if you had to narrow it down to one or two areas, what triggered such a demand for change? Because the numbers don't lie. The numbers were nowhere near as bad as they were made out to be during the campaign. So in your opinion, what was the Great Depression moment of 2023, 2024 that led us to this swing?
So when FDR passed away, his funeral train was passing through this one town, and this reporter noticed this black gentleman, and he was sobbing uncontrollably as the train was passing by. And the reporter goes up to this gentleman and says, "Sir, did you know the president?" And he goes, "I didn't know the president, but he knew me." And I think that's what resonates with the majority, so to speak, that voted for Donald Trump is, I think with his rhetoric, I think people feel like their voice is being heard.
So let me interject a little bit, and let's break this down a little bit. My question would be on what matters, on what topics did he connect or resonate? We can talk about the obvious one, immigration. Most people, year over year, day to day, don't think about immigration. They're not affected by immigration directly, at least from a human perspective. The prices, the services, the goods that they spend money on might be, that's the economic argument. But where he resonated with them, it seemed to be in stoking fear or perception of these groups of people, right? Global conflict. It amazes me how many people are specialists in Middle Eastern historical warfare, that...
Well, I mean, Trump is going back to the two things that Napoleon said to focus on. When you want to, run with it, so to speak.
Right.
And he said, focus on self-interest and fear. Yeah. And if you focus on self-interest and fear, you can win the day. And that's why...
In spite of facts.
Yeah. I mean, that's why Napoleon had his own newspapers. He literally just published his own stories about how great he was at war and how he always won and all his great policies and all this stuff, And you can run with that for a certain period of time, and then people wake up from their slumber, and they look at reality, and they go, oh, this isn't correct. And so what I think you're going to find is people saw gas prices that were going up. Obviously, they've gone down significantly since then.
Right.
But they've seen other things, such as, their grocery bills go up and, whatever they're paying service providers, that cost is going up. All these costs are going up, and there's no cost controls in place having that come down. And so somebody comes along and they say, you demonize the people that were in office and said, they didn't do anything right, and look at your pocketbook. You got less money today than you did 4 years ago under me. And look at all these wars that are happening, and look at all these people that are, crossing over the border. I am attacking your self-interest, and I'm attacking your fear. And as long as I hone in on those two things, I will win almost every single time. And his rhetoric was very, very good at convincing people that, hey, these are major problems in your life, and I have the solutions for them, and I'm going to fix them.
So let me ask you this then. The economy, the market, politics, friendships, you name it, everything in this world to a degree, baggy jeans is cyclical, right? If you had to guess or project, what would be the one area that you think will immediately, given the rhetoric, given maybe the lack of policy on a particular area or thing, what do you think is going to be the first thing maybe to show a chink in the armor that it was more performative? Because again, this stoking fear, that's performative. It's hyperbole to a large degree. What might be the area that you think the average Joe that bought the fear or believed in the fear or manifested it into their own lives, therefore supporting Donald Trump and MAGA? What might be an area that you think is going to be quickest to swing it back? Newton's cradle, so to speak.
Sure. I actually think it's going to be two things. First is going to be the tariffs. Saying that you're going to implement 25% tariffs on imports from Mexico and Canada, our two largest trading partners, is literally the dumbest thing that I've ever heard of. And you've got Republicans and Democrats, economists, almost every economist under the sun. If you're talking about like free market economies,
right?
And Milton Friedman, all these guys were absolutely against tariffs. It's the dumbest thing in the world. And so right away, you're going to see price increases across the board. And they're all on things that maybe you don't think that you need. And then you go to the store and you're like, wow, this just went up another 25%, or this just went up another 50%.
Right.
And so I think that's going to hit people's pocketbooks right away. The other part that I think is going to be affected by it, that is going to affect people's mindsets, is the mass deportation policies. Is that when you start to see people rounded up in the streets, and people taken to detention camps, and then you have the world news that starts covering that, and then you have the lawsuits that come out of it, and you have possible loss of life or people getting injured, then it starts to hit close to home, because you're like, I know what it's like to have a family. Yeah. I know what it's like to see a child in that kind of situation and not have a mother or father around.
Take Ilian Gonzalez times 10 million.
Oh yeah, it's not going to be something that people are going to want to see their country put into that light.
Right.
And we don't want that. We don't want that kind of attention on us. And so I think eventually it's going to hit home where we go, guys, we got to scale this back. This is not who we are. We cannot take things to this kind of extreme. I know we said we wanted to tame, get rid of inflation, and we wanted to be able to pay for these tax cuts with tariffs. And I know we wanted to, get rid of the undocumented immigrants that we had here. But we took it too far. Well, now we need to take it back.
Yeah. So how do you personally feel along the lines of that narrative, that what you're describing is really the political campaign as they laid out? All of these things. Well, we didn't really mean 100% tariff. We didn't really mean all 14 million. We didn't really mean this. To the point where we go back to the debate and he's, they ask for a plan. He's like, well, I have concepts of a plan. At some point, like the vast majority of his campaign was hyperbole. Why shouldn't we expect better if we're going to elect somebody, right? I mean, imagine this happening on Wall Street, right? Any type of board. So the proposed new board president comes in, and the board, representing all the shareholders, says, tell us your thoughts, tell us your ideas. Well, I have concepts. Nobody would ever put an individual like that in a position of power. Yet we gave that person the presidency. How do we fix managing the expectation? How do we hold their feet to the fire to look, if it's a good idea and you show me a way to implement it, I'm going to vote for you. If they try to steal the idea, hey, fair game, but that's probably good for the population. Do you see an opportunity or a point in the near future where we divest ourselves from platitudes and actually move into a more educated policy conversation? Is that possible?
Going back to what I talked about earlier with what happened in the 1920s and then the policies that came out of the Great Depression and then what happened during the Great Recession and then the policies that came out of that. America's going to need a heart attack event. That's what's going to change it. It's the only, I mean, going back to slavery, you know, from the 1600s to 1865, you know, this disgusting act was on our shores and the country made a fortune off of it. I mean, I saw a statistic one time that just blew my mind, which is you could take all the assets in the South at that time, prior to the Civil War starting, and they were worth more than everything else in the country combined. No question. But it took a civil war where we killed off an 18th of our population. We destroyed an entire region to get people to come to the table and go, you're wrong. This is wrong. And then it took another 100 years to go through the KKK and Reconstruction and then, you know,
civil rights,
public lynchings, and then, you know, the civil rights movement to actually give black people rights. Like it takes a while sometimes for change to happen in this country.
Isn't that crazy though? In 2024, where theoretically we have more data at our fingertips, more quote broad education available to everyone, the ability to communicate quicker, the ability to solve problems faster. I mean, we have NVIDIA that is literally changing how brains will work in a matter of 10, 15, 20 years, right? Everything is faster and better, theoretically, on paper or in application. Why does it seem like it's becoming more difficult to get to understanding or agreement?
I wouldn't say that what we have from an education standpoint today is better. I think that we can just do things faster. I mean, we've moved from an abacus to a calculator. You know, we're obviously we're learning faster, but do we actually comprehend what we're learning?
Right.
You know, I can have AI give me a dissertation on why the Civil War happened and then what happened as a result of it. But did that really teach me anything? Unless I actually read books about it, unless I go to these Civil War sites and, you know, take in how disastrous this was, you don't really get a feel for it. I mean, I really didn't understand the impact of slavery until I actually went to a plantation and I walked through slave quarters and I was like, my God, I can't believe that we did this. But I think that just because we have more access to knowledge doesn't mean that we're more knowledgeable. I think in some respects, it makes us more lazy and we don't have to try as hard if we have other pieces of technology or talking heads on TV telling us what to think and what to do.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. I think maybe I misled my premise in so much that I'm 100% in agreement with you. We have access to more and better. We are not applying it in a way that is reaping results that would theoretically point to a more integrated populace, a more understanding, a more empathetic.
Well, I mean, put it a different way. Over these last couple of years, for the first time in well over a century, we've had a declining age expectancy in this country.
Yeah.
You know, life expectancy, excuse me. It's declining. We are the most advanced society in the world in terms of medical technology and drugs. And we have the best universities here. I mean, we have all the talent here, but we're declining in our life expectancy. Why is that happening? And the reason for that is still education. You can have access to all this under the sun, but if you don't have the discipline to lay off the donuts or cigarettes or the alcohol and get some exercise and get off the couch.
Well, in the obvious outlier, when we compare ourselves to European nations in particular, certain Asian nations, et cetera, Scandinavia is healthcare, access to universal healthcare. You know, what is the stat? The 40 most developed nations in the world, there's one nation that does not have universal healthcare. That's us. And we are seeing a decrease in age expected ages, right? Where do you view the balance between our technology, our institutions, our hospitals, in developing care, in developing drugs, in developing surgical procedures, et cetera, yet it's all embedded for the most part in a for-profit system that, you know, it's not proving out to being the most efficient because the results are, you know, from a shareholder perspective, it's killing it, literally.
Yeah, it's an incredibly difficult dichotomy that we have because in many respects, our healthcare is socialist. Medicare, Medicaid, you know.
Well, the programs that work
Yeah.
are socialist.
Yes. And then you have this, for-profit model that's built in where, we're discouraging generic drugs. We're lengthening the period of time in which drugs are held under patents so they continue to be more expensive. And, first and foremost, I'm a capitalist. So
Right.
I understand that, you've got to have incentives out there to make high quality drugs, machines, all this equipment, so you can generate a profit. And that's your incentive for doing so. Totally agree with those things. I think the reason why you are seeing a regression in terms of how we're taking care of our life expectancy or our knowledge of politics and just, daily current events, it all comes down to, I think, the great panacea, which is education. It's all about education. When you look at the societies that have gone from the doldrums and turned around really, really quickly, and you can list them off pretty easily, over the last 75 years, Taiwan, Singapore, and South Korea. All three of those nations had one thing in common, which is education. They were ardent on education. And when you have an educated class, a more informed class of people, then they make better healthcare decisions. They make better, they become better law-abiding citizens, and they, I think, become a more informed populace.
Let's shift real quick. I kind of want to take the totality of some of the things that we've touched on. Macro changes in leadership have occurred at the national level. We've talked about that from Great Depression to current. We're talking about education. We're talking about as that expands, you improve from the bottom up when you have a smarter population. I too am a capitalist. You gotta get a lot of things out of the way because at the end of the day, market efficiencies work.
Correct.
In a really high percentages, I should say. Let's apply this to the city of St. Louis, our backyard here, where we sit right now. You were involved with the St. Louis Economic Development Partnership. Obviously, you have a hankering for the city, kind of a passion for the region. Let's put the lens on the 314 because we are nationally. We've regularly been kind of an outlier in case studies, primarily due to our physical structure, city-county split. Us and good old Baltimore are the lone two standing. Some of the more recent ones that have gone the other way, not ironically or unironically, I don't know which it is actually. Indianapolis and Nashville have both merged over the past 10, 15 years, and they both seem to be thriving from an economic perspective. A whole other list of areas. Give a quick State of the Union as to the city of St. Louis, because we do have specific silos. We've got the business community, the heavy hitters. We've got the micro business community that always seems to be fighting a good fight on social media. And then we have a city hall that seems to be just kind of a wash, rinse, repeat of variations of really the same thing over the past 20, 30, 40 years at a minimum. So give me your quick State of the Union on the city of St. Louis from a, grade it. A, you're killing it. The development's off the charts. Population should be flooding in, which we know is not happening. To F, just turn the lights off. Let's start this thing over.
First, St. Louis is an amazing place. And I didn't realize how amazing St. Louis was until I left it for 7 years. And, I lived in the South. I lived on the East Coast. And, Mark Twain, alludes to this in a quote where he says, the most ignorant, racist, bigoted man that you'll ever meet is an old man from a small town that never left. And he also said in another quote, travel is fatal to prejudice and bigotry and all these other things. And I think that was so important in my growth to be a good citizen to St. Louis, to actually live outside of it for a while and see how, part of the other country was run.
Yeah,
and then come back.
Where'd you live?
I lived in a couple different places. So I lived in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, lived in Blacksburg, Virginia, so southwestern Virginia, lived in D.C., Tallahassee, Florida, and then lived in Pittsburgh for a couple summers.
So all law related or real estate or a little
Undergrad, law, and then internships.
Got it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm with you because I went away for college, came back to finish college, and then I lived in Chicago for 7 years in that 21, 22 to, almost 30. And it just, my perception and perspective both changed drastically. And I didn't really realize it until I moved back. Moved back for some pragmatic reasons. It costs a living, period.
Oh, yeah.
About to have a kid, grandparents,
Right.
big, but I completely viewed the city through a different lens. So let me, because I hear you describing the pros of it, and I think we would all agree, like from a foundational standpoint, culture, the real estate, the brick and mortar, and really how far your dollar goes, because that's really what it comes down to. In a lot of these conversations, like what can you get done? Well, everything costs money, and it's cheaper here. Let's get past that. What do you think is one of the greatest assets that St. Louis has as it pertains to development, appeal, or the potential of growth?
There's so much. As you alluded to it, cost of living is unbelievable. And I think that's a massive advantage that St. Louis has and will have as, you've had these shifts in demographics, over the last century, where you had a bunch of people living on the East Coast, Great Depression happens, it's kind of like the grapes of wrath and the Jodes going out west, to California where the jobs are. The East Coast and the West Coast become too expensive, so what do people do? Then they follow down to Arizona and Texas and Florida. I think as those areas become too expensive, as those areas face climate change, I think you're going to see a regression back to the Midwest where things are more cost effective. So I think that is a massive advantage that we have. I think another advantage that we have is our strategic location. The fact that our state is crisscrossed by the fourth largest river system in the world. We have the second largest inland port in the country. We are the only major U.S. city that has 4 U.S. interstates that run through it. St. Louis has all the tools to be a great city again. I mean, back in 1904, and that's why my management company is called 1904 Group, we were the toast of the world. We were called the Rome of the West.
Right.
We had so much clout that the first Olympics in the United States was actually awarded to Chicago, and we threatened to host our own Olympics, and they took it away from Chicago and gave it to us. That's the swagger that we had. And the problem is that we lost it. We suck at cheerleading. We're too damn humble. And we've got to wake up and say, look, we're a fucking amazing city. Let's come back.
So let me pick on the word humble. It feels as if you're describing kind of St. Louisan as humble. But within our region, I think humble would be towards the end of the list of how we would describe ourselves mano a mano. And what I mean by that is, this city of St. Louis and the powers that be compared to St. Louis County and the powers that be. And then we also have 2 other institutions that would be the Metro East, because they're under the Pritzker, governorship. And then St. Charles County is now, its fingers are reaching further into a lot of the everyday life of St. Louis County in particular. And then I'm going to add one more, and that would be Jeff City. We are a supermajority Republican state across the board. So much of the policy and the decisions that are made that affect every single address in the state stem and are driven out of Jeff City. So here's my question. We're humble. We tend to not step on the gas when we can or should. For example, the example you just used, we shut down Chicago for the Olympics. But now we have so much infighting that, it seems like, where's the path forward? How would you approach just the local logistics to try and maybe streamline these conversations? Because if the museum district or if the tourism district within the city of St. Louis, the pro sports teams, et cetera, if they don't thrive, there's a domino effect. The universities, if they don't thrive, there's a domino effect, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Where would you start? How do we start to create a little bit of synergy? Maybe not with other states, but how about 8 miles down the road with St. Louis County?
There was a gentleman who I will not name that met with me almost exactly this time last year and asked me when I was running for mayor. And I told him, I said, I have no interest in doing it until the city and the county are united. That's the first thing you have to have. We haven't been united since the late 1870s. The last time unification has been on the ballot was the early 1970s. We've kicked the can down the road on this issue for, over 50 years?
Right.
It makes no sense to me why that hasn't been put on the ballot, and you at least talk about it, and you at least break down some of those barriers, and you might lose the first couple times, but you can, through that discussion and through getting exposed to one another, you can break down some of these assumptions that we have about one another, and we can finally unite again. I mean, Lincoln was very, very prophetic when he was making a point to the country when he said, a house divided against itself cannot stand. We will never succeed as a region. We will never succeed as a region until St. Louis County and St. Louis City are finally united again. And that can happen. That actually can happen relatively easily.
Yeah.
You can put it on the ballot, and you can do exactly what they did in Louisville, where, I think it was either Louisville or Jefferson County, I can't remember which one, but they were admitted as a municipality into the other. And so St. Louis City would be admitted into St. Louis County as a municipality. Everything else would stay the same. Our courts would stay here, our mayor would stay here, our police, our debt, all of it would still stay in the city. But at least we would start dating again. And then once we start dating, then we can start to look at some of the synergies that we have with one another to see if we can eventually get to a marriage. But that's never going to happen unless we put it on the ballot and unless we unite again. That has to happen first.
So let me ask you a question. The merger would be critical in your view. Like macro development can't occur unless that hits the table sooner than later. And when I say macro development, I mean like truly nationally competitive with the Nashvilles of the world, et cetera. And I know that there are certain things going on here that we can say, numbers look good. But again, the numbers are skewed because we're basing it on 300,000, not our 1.5 or whatever the number is all in. How would you define a win? Like, what would be a win, in your opinion, for the city after a merger were to occur? Would it be a population uptick? Would it be a GDP uptick? Would it be debt reduction? Because there has to be a list. Can't do it all at once. So what would be a win in your view, or something that you would like to see focused on?
Well, to take a line from James Carville, where he was talking about it's the economy stupid. I would say with respect to the city, it's the people stupid. You get an increase in population in the city. Other businesses are going to take notice of that, and they're going to relocate to the city, and they're going to provide services to people that live in the city. You're going to have more tax revenue that comes into the city as a result of that increase in population, which means you can pay for more services, which means that you can provide a better quality of life. It's what starts everything. It starts with the people. You have to have an increase in population and do whatever you can to maintain their safety and figure out ways to provide them with jobs and figure out ways to provide them with an environment that, fits their lifestyle, and run with it, and then start talking about it and broadcast it. And that's one of the reasons why I said we're too humble. We need to broadcast to the rest of the country. I would literally, if I was running the show, I would be putting up billboards all over major cities across the country, talking about the cost of living in St. Louis, talking about the average cost of a home in St. Louis. I would do everything I could to tug on their purse strings.
Yeah,
say, get here.
Subsidize the Gelman team so that they could put that 2,000 square foot 4-bedroom for $198 on billboards in Philadelphia. That would be hilarious.
But I mean, when you look back at how the Midwest was founded,
yeah,
It was founded by developers going to Germany and to Scandinavia and bringing nice little pictures with them of what the Midwest looked like, which it did not look like in the pictures that they were presenting, and convincing millions of them to make a journey across an ocean and then land in the East Coast and then make another longer journey just to get to the Midwest. But that's how it was populated.
To make German beer.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah. But we have to grow the population here.
So let me ask your take on this, because obviously you're involved in real estate, multifamily in particular. And, you know, the hand-in-hand conversation that I hear or debate that occurs often is the population drain. And everybody, justifiably so, the numbers don't lie, they point to north of Del Mar for the vast majority of the population flight. However, you go south of Del Mar and you pick your neighborhood. I don't think it really matters. Soulard, I just noticed, had 2 recently over the past 5 years. You've got big ones near Ballpark Village. And what I'm talking about are those massive apartment complexes that are really targeted towards millennial and under. You know, 1-bedrooms that are in the 700-800 square foot range that are renting to the tune of $1,600 to $2,000 and above, and even higher for the multi-bedrooms. So that development is occurring all over the area, right? And there's petitions and applications that are in for even more of these types of apartment complexes. How do you balance the narrative between the demand for these uber, what would appear to be very high end or more expensive apartment, you know, communal lifestyles, and the flight in a lot of neighborhoods from, you know, these lower income, affordable housing, et cetera? You know, you could lose 2 to 3 families worth of rent that equates to the GDP value of one of these 2-bed, 2-bath new apartments, right? So how do you view that? Because there's demand for higher ticket items, but we're losing people. Where do you see the relationship between the two?
A really good friend of mine, Benjamin Anderson, lives in North City, and he sat on a neighborhood board there, and they did a survey, of over 700 people in the neighborhood. And he asked them, he's like, what's the most important issue that needs to be fixed in your neighborhood? And the number one vote getter wasn't fixing crime, wasn't education, wasn't jobs.
Can I guess?
What's that?
Potholes.
That's a good one. Vacant buildings.
Really?
Vacant buildings. When you think of the mindset of you're living in North City, you know, chances are you're living in a house that you don't own. You're coming out of a household where it's probably single parent, you know, and then you're walking out onto a street where there's derelict cars, where there's abandoned buildings on fire, you know, that's your environment. What do you think that does to someone's psyche? I mean, it destroys it. What hope do you have? And so I think the first thing that you have to do is clean the canvas off and repaint a new one. And I would have an initiative where I would put incentives in place for developers. Don't have the city pay for it, but have incentives in place for the developers that you will get these incentives if you build X amount of homes in this period of time. Then we'll provide you with these tax credits, which then you can sell it on the open market and get your investment back.
But how do you get over now this is the construction guy in me, how do you get over the reality of square foot cost, where we have such a love affair with brick, right? We have such a love affair with this classic architecture. But the reality is the cost to build that 2-story red brick or that gray stone, brownstone, you know, and do it in that manner, it's just cost prohibitive. And it doesn't match up with any city across the country that is developing from an urban standpoint. You see infill that is more modern, more compartmental, right? Different types of materials that are more cost effective. City, because in my experience, when you go to do these developments, it's not enough to just get the architect to draw something that fits. You then got to go in front of the ARB, and you got to go in front of all these other things to make your project back into 1904 standards. Do you see that as good for culture, good for branding, or is it a barrier to entry for new investors?
So I am a preservationist, and I've done a number of historical properties. I live in a a home that was built in 1870 in Lafayette Square. I think preserving one's history is incredibly important. With that being said, that's only possible with capital,
Right.
and making sure that a development is going to be profitable at the end of the day. We don't have time for that. We need to go up to North City right now, and the buildings that cannot be turned around, they need to be leveled. And then we need to look at other types of housing, like modular housing. I was just speaking with a developer a couple weeks ago about hemp housing that he's going to be putting into some North City sites. And the folks that I've spoken with regarding the modular housing, they can build this stuff down in Texas and then have it assembled on that site and have everything working in about a week. Like, that's how fast they can do it. Once you have the foundation and your plumbing and all the other stuff run, okay? In a week, they can have it gone, And so I'm looking at this and saying, look, yeah, we could spend another couple of decades trying to fix up, the historic properties that are there, but that doesn't solve the problem. We need to solve the problem now.
I mean, wouldn't it make sense to just kind of, because there's so many blocks that are underappreciated, underpopulated, et cetera. Couldn't we just segment it out a little bit better? I understand that if you have enough inventory that is not beyond the point of no return from a renovation standpoint, because the dollars matter. We all know what that is. If it's bowed too much, if your foundation's gone, if you're looking at half of the masonry, it's just financially not feasible. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't matter what the buyer's bringing to the table, or especially the renter. And here's where I'm going with this. At our peak, it was 950,000 people in the city of St. Louis, roughly?
It was pretty high, yeah.
And now we're at 300?
We're at, last count, like 283,000.
283. But we still have 950,000 people worth of streets and infrastructure and everything else. And, and we have 285,000 or whatever it is, right? Why can't we immediately just start to create ratios of expectation? I went to a meeting the other night with a potential mayoral candidate in the spring, and they talked about the number one issue that they hear is streets and trash, right? And immediately talks about how big the city was and how many streets we have, and then they talked about the population loss, and it just felt as if there was a complete disconnect where they're actively admitting that we have kind of a play box or a backyard that is so big, but we only have kids that fit in this corner. But yet we want to talk about a budget required to fix the whole freaking playground equally. Why can't we just start segmenting it? Because it feels as if it feels as if it's an all or in St. Louis. It always feels as if it's an all or nothing proposition from a political activation standpoint.
I think you see some of the aldermen in greater St. Louis try to run with that and say, look, let's just focus on investing in downtown and North St. Louis. Let's focus on those two things first. And I agree. I think that if you segment it and come up with a master plan, and it's kind of like, how do you eat a whale? One bite at a time. Don't take on the entire thing. Just keep it simple.
Start at the nose.
And and I think if they do that and you put the proper incentives in place, you will see neighborhoods turned around. And I've seen this firsthand when I first started developing Shaw. That was probably 30 or 40% developed when I got in there. Same thing with Tower Grove East, Tower Grove South, McKinley Heights. Now I'm redeveloping a property right now in Mount Pleasant, and that neighborhood is starting to turn around. It's very infectious, but you have to have the incentives in place for capitalism to work. Otherwise it flounders, and we can't rely on socialism where we're just handing out millions of dollars of grants and we have no idea where these things are going to, because you're giving people fish and you're not teaching them how to fish. And that's what you can do when you have the proper investment in your community and you have the incentives aligned, is that you can turn them around relatively quickly where they become prosperous communities again.
So what, in your opinion, why do you think it is that whenever developers / investors, why are they shunned upon so often in the city when they go into a neighborhood? And I get the gentrification arguments. That's a largely philosophical, but you often, anytime somebody comes in that wants to do something big and they ask for a little bit of skin in the game from the city, whether it's abatement, whether it's a incentive or whatever it is, it's almost as if the public at large and those that are actively involved in politics and close to the aldermanic world are trained to immediately view this individual or this organization as bloodthirsty. They're coming to take our jobs or take our equity and make everything, too expensive. What is it going to take to educate and get these individuals to understand that when developers like yourself and others come into a neighborhood or a edge neighborhood, that it's about creating opportunities for those that live within those neighborhoods to generate their own equity, right? Because what you're really talking about is how do you put more money in people's pockets, period. That's what it comes down to. They want to be safe. They don't want to be shot, right? What's your message? How do you encourage development in areas, but expect? Because I do think there's an expectation, in my opinion, the city should be expected to be part of these developments in some manner or another. Skin in the game. Do you view it that way? Do you think the city should be more actively involved in tax incentives, abatements? Because it feels as if it's always pushback.
I think when you look at Missouri's involvement with state historic tax credits, we were one of the first states to run with that.
Yeah.
And the state of Missouri and the local municipalities have made an absolute fortune off of that. For every dollar in tax credits that was given out, the state and other local governments got $7 back. I had a Missouri state rep tell me that. It blew my mind, but it works. It works. Capitalism has taken more people out of poverty in this country than anything else. At the end of 1970, the poverty rate in this country was about 11%. Do you know what it is today? It's about 11%. Hasn't really gone up. It's been about stagnant. Capitalism has done wonders for this country. There's a reason. This past year, we had over $26 trillion GDP. Okay, it's more than the next two countries behind it, which are China and Japan.
And a $36 trillion debt.
Yeah, but that equates out to almost $80,000 per citizen, per 330 some odd million people. But I think people need to have the message tailored to them, where it touches their self-interest. You can't focus on, we're going to build this big, beautiful thing and it's going to make everything safe. No. What's their self-interest, okay? If I can tell you that by bringing this in, I'm going to make your schools better because more money's going towards it. And I'm going to make the police better because I'm going to have more money going towards that.
Right.
And our earnings tax revenue is going to go up because we're going to have more people living here. And then people are going to be, paying our sales tax because we have more people living here. But people have to understand, as Oliver Wendell Holmes once said, and I'm paraphrasing it, but taxation provides civilization, and you need that tax revenue to come in to sustain that type of environment that you envision, that you want to live in. And when people talk about or demonize these incentives that are given to developers, look at the tax code. The tax code is nothing but incentive based.
Right.
And so I would say if you're not happy with it, change the tax code then too, because you wouldn't have a lot of the things around you unless you had people willing to make bets on future outcomes and hope that would happen, and also know while they're doing it that the odds are overwhelmingly against them on succeeding.
So City of St. Louis, let's talk about the north side first, because that is obviously the area that most people hyper-focus on, trying to come up with ideas or strategies to stop the bleeding first, right? How do you view it? Do you view it as, if you had to prioritize, what you would attack first? Would it be more homes? Would it be crime? Would it be jobs? Because would it be basic infrastructure? Because there's no grocery stores. So we hear about these food deserts, that are, all over the area. You got to pick. If you had to pick one, what would you start with? Because you can't do all 4 or 5 or 6 at the same time.
You have to start with investment. I did a post about this the other day, on the Mount Pleasant school that we did down in the Mount Pleasant neighborhood. And that's one of the roughest neighborhoods in South City.
Mm-hmm.
And we took, our rental income down there, we raised it 94% over that period of time. And we made it safer. We provided better amenities for the tenants, and they loved it, and they were willing to pay for it. That's capitalism at work. And I bet you those tenants will then, spend money in the local economy around there, and then that helps lift up those local businesses because they're going to spend more money, and then it takes off from there. And then other developers then see what I'm doing, and they go, wow, Jarrad's hitting those kind of numbers. I want to start investing down in Mount Pleasant. Let's take that off there. And so I think to turn around North St. Louis, you have to have investment there, but you have to have investments that are incentive-based, because then that shows, those people that are taking those risks that, hey, the government's got your back here. If you follow through on X, Y, and Z, I'm not going to hand you money, but if you follow through on X, Y, and Z, then I'll give you money at the end of it. And by then, we've already made our money back.
Right.
And I wish people would take that not short-sighted view, but more of a long-term view of the area's got to get better. It's not going to change unless you have investment. Once you get investment, you get people living there. Once you get people living there, the businesses come in, the tax revenue starts to come in, and then, focus on safety and then oversight.
Well, isn't it ultimately the chickens and the eggs? Because, for example, from a real estate perspective, the public school system is funded primarily through property taxes, right? Okay, well, if we're losing renters, if we're losing owners, if we're losing buildings, well, then property taxes inevitably are going down. Therefore, the schools get less. Same thing as it applies to funding first responders, et cetera. Actually, I'm going to shift real quick. I want to ask you this. I asked this of a previous guest. Rams money, ARPA money. There's a big pile of money that the city of St. Louis has at its fingertips that appears to be sitting. You're on the clock. What would you do first? You said $750 million, $500 million, whatever the number is. What would you do first with that money to try and not be stagnant?
If I had a magic wand and could do anything with it, and this idea is kind of out there, and it doesn't serve, I think it serves an immediate need right away. I would put all of that money into an S&P 500 ETF, low cost.
SPY?
Yeah, and hear me out. Here's what I would do. I would make an announcement in every national publication that would say that if you live in the city of St. Louis for a minimum of 10 years, and you can prove it on your tax returns, that we will pay for you to go to college or to trade school anywhere in the state of Missouri. We'll pay for it. If you did that, you would have an influx of people moving to St. Louis overnight. And not only that, you would stop the bleeding of everybody leaving the city because they have hope. They have a way out. But you have to provide that. There was a gentleman named Harris Rosen. You can look this up. New York Times did a story about this probably about 10 years ago. He went to a small neighborhood community in Orlando that at the time had one of the highest crime rates, one of the highest dropout rates, and predominantly black community. And he said, I'm going to invest in before school programs, after school programs, and anybody that sticks with me on these programs, goes through them, I will pay for your tuition and room and board at any in-state school in Florida. Within a decade, everything in that neighborhood changed. The crime rate went down, the dropout rate went down, the graduation rates went up, the home values went up. Everything changed because you gave people hope. So if I had a magic wand and could do anything, I'd focus on education, and you would have a plethora of people coming in here overnight.
Well, theoretically, for example, you talked about the idea of a trade school. I mean, if I'm a for-profit trade school and I hear the state of Missouri is doing that, I'm putting a welding campus in North City. So to your point, education is a long-term. It's much more than a long-term investment. It literally is a culture shifter.
Oh, it would change everything. And then you have an educated population base, and as a result of it, you have more income coming in. And because people are in school, because they're studying, and they're not out on the streets, there's less crimes that are being committed. When you look at the majority of the violent crimes that are committed in the city, It literally happens between the ages of, being a teenager to, mid 20s, late 20s. That's it. That's literally that's the age range right there. But that's also a lost group of people that needs help. They need a way out. And I think it is, our responsibility to help them do that.
So let me ask you this, and then we go full circle to how I started off talking about the city of St. Louis in particular. Why do you think it is, in comparing, contrasting to our national discussion earlier, where we were talking about the cyclical nature of leadership and change and politics in general? What do you think it is in the city of St. Louis that we don't see that type of cyclical movement? We do tend to see a more linear approach to our leadership from an elected perspective. The current mayor, Tashara Jones, she's part of an institution that is St. Louis politics, via her father et al. And even some of the other candidates that are running, there's a little bit of variation, but it doesn't feel that different. How do you view that? Do you view that as a good thing for the city? Do you view that as a barrier to entry? Because to a degree, we're not seeing true new faces or new ideas. And if they are out there, we're not hearing them, right? They're in echo chambers somewhere. Why do you think that is? Why do you think St. Louis tends to wash, rinse, repeat for generations when it comes to political leadership?
Because people have to be inspired. If you want them to rise up, they have to be inspired. If you look at, post 1865, how long did it take till the civil rights movement? 100 years, about 100 years. It took that long for an Evers and an MLK and an X to come along to change things. You had to wait, women in this country had to wait several hundred years to get the right to vote before the suffragettes came along. You have to have the right leaders come along that inspire people to go, I'm tired of this shit and I want it to change now. And my generation is going to be the one to do it. My generation is going to be the one that actually stops this. And those leaders are out there. They're out there, they are speaking up. They just need to be inspired and to know that they can take the next steps to then help change this. Because if St. Louis wants to change, if St. Louis wants to become an amazing city again, and there's not a doubt in my mind that it will happen, it all comes down to leadership. It all comes down to leadership. And when the right leaders rise up, this place will completely change. It'll change overnight, like a Nashville did, like a Louisville did, like an Indianapolis did.
How do you view the role that the private sector plays in what's going on in St. Louis today? Take the Taylors in particular and the Hoffmans, et cetera. I mean, call it what it is. They're putting their money where their mouth is, right? Specifically with the city park and the new team, and there's so much development that's occurring from a private perspective, and it seems to be happening in a vacuum. Now, I get that there's plenty of PR that is being done that makes it look as if everything is copacetic and everybody's cutting the ribbon at the same time, but those scissors are definitively different sizes. Do you think that they're doing? Do you think they're doing enough? Could they do more? Are they doing more than they should be? Because again, the city has Rams money and everything else, and there's a little bit of a public feud that's going on between the current Inc. and City Hall. What's their role moving forward? Should they just stay the course, do what they do best, make investments and develop as they view the market, or should they lean on City Hall harder?
Stay the course isn't working. It's not working. It hasn't worked for a long time. You guys can continue to throw money at something. It's not going to change until your voices are heard. It will not. It literally means nothing. I mean, like I said, you could throw millions of dollars in grants, whether it be North City or businesses or all this different crap. It doesn't make a difference unless your voice is heard. And once you show people that you're pissed off about it and that you want it to change, and your voice matches your dollars, then people will be inspired by that and go, you know what? Things do have to change. We do have to have some different policies in here. We do have to change up the rule book now. Out with the old, in with the new. Let's run with it. But the idea that St. Louis is going to change on its own by staying the course and continuing to make these, investments, which, as a city of St. Louis resident, I'm greatly, greatly appreciative of, what they've done to fund the arts and sports teams and, all these other things that, help make our life wonderful. That's not enough. You are standing on the shoulders of other people that came before you, that built this city, that helped build your company. All of that happened because of them. You owe it to them. Nobody is self-made in this country. You are standing on the shoulders of other people. It is your duty as a citizen to give back, to help, to do whatever you can, especially if you're, given the gift of means to do it. To me, what does it profit a man to gain the whole world but to lose his soul? It's that.
So
change the world around you.
Let me ask you a question then, hypothetically, kind of like picking a character, a type of individual that you would like to see maybe steer this ship. And I want to look at the national landscape, and I'm going to name some names. And what I'd like you to do is, maybe give me an example, or you name another name that you think would be the type of leader that you think checks the boxes that you view as necessary for St. Louis to move forward. Is it an individual like a Pete Buttigieg? Is it a Bernie Sanders? Is it a Gavin Newsom? Is it a take anybody in Texas that's like, get rid of taxes, we don't care. What's the kind of individual that you view from a character / policy standpoint would be appropriate to lead the current scenario here in the 314?
Harry Truman, by far. By far. I mean, he's the greatest.
That's cheat code, because now there's a whole bunch of young listeners. Who's Harry Truman?
Harry Truman. No, I mean, Harry Truman is the greatest politician that Missouri has ever produced. Grew up in a very, very humble background outside of Independence, Missouri. Was a captain during World War II. Had a couple failed businesses. Rose up essentially from nothing. He did not come from money. Yeah. Came from an agrarian background, but was always just a straight talker, honest, cussed like a sailor, but wanted to get shit done. And the policies that he was pushing forth, nobody was talking about them at the time. He was the first president to push for civil rights legislation. You can look that up. He actually issued an executive order desegregating the armed forces because he couldn't get anything through Congress. Okay, he was the first president to push through nationalizing healthcare. This guy was way ahead of the game. He was the first president to recognize Israel and actually push forth, their Israel becoming a country in 1948. This guy was way ahead of the game. And people shit on him when he left office. He had one of the lowest approval ratings of all time. And now when you look up presidential rankings, he's in the top 10 every year because they realized how prophetic he was about how he looked at things. And it was just balls and strikes. It wasn't gray. It was black and white. He called it like he saw it.
How does Missouri go from a Harry Truman landscape to Rush and Hawley? It's because they all grew up in the same, theoretically, kind of the same landscape. And my question to you, facetiously, is what happened to Missouri? Because if Missouri was able to produce a Harry Truman who was so forward-thinking, given his agrarian background, given his kind of brass tacks kind of approach, Missouri does. We're not putting out those types of individuals right now.
Missouri has not lost itself, not by a long shot. I don't believe that whatsoever.
We're just not voting for those.
I think Missouri is one of the most interesting states out there because for up until 2000, I believe it was election of 2008.
Yeah,
we were a bellwether state.
Yeah,
we literally went with the winning presidential candidate in almost every election for going back 50 years. It was nuts. Okay, Missouri elects Democrats. We elect Republicans. For a long time, we had Mel Carnahan as a Democratic governor, and we had Jay Nixon as a Democratic governor. When you look at ballot initiatives that come on,
We pass them all.
We pass almost every one of them. And you could say in large part that those were liberal issues.
Yeah.
But I think Missouri deep down has a very common sense, kind of farmer-like approach on how they look at the issues. And I do not think that we are deep red. I do not think that we are blue. I think that we are a very, very purple state. Once again, you have to have the right leaders, the right politicians come about that will talk, that straight talk to them. And that's what they want. They want that person to come along.
It is funny. When we put things on ballot initiatives, let's expand socialist healthcare. Yes. Let's legalize weed. Yes. Let's raise minimum wage. Yes. You name it. Sports betting. Yes. It doesn't matter. Abortion. Yes. We want the right. We do all those things. And yet we are no longer a bellwether.
I think that also goes back to, I think they're looking at the leaders nationally right now, and they're saying, who is speaking to me? Who feels what I'm feeling? And I think the Republican Party is doing a better job of touching, to not sound like a Hallmark card, but I will, hitting their feelings. And they're not feeling it right now. When they're going around their communities and they're looking at double-digit unemployment and they're looking at factories leaving and they're looking at the issues that we're focusing on nationally, whether it be, woke or trans or whatever, and they're like, this isn't affecting me. Why are we talking about this? And it pisses them off, and I don't blame them. And we have to, I think as Missourians and even nationally, we have to stop getting away from those issues that don't affect us on a daily basis.
Right.
And look at their communities and say, hey, what do you need? How can I help you? And then address those things. And I think when we have leaders that come around in Missouri, I think that you'll see they're not going to look at whether they have an R or a D after their last name. They're going to look at it and go, so-and-so's got his shit together. I'm voting for that guy. That guy's got a good plan. I'm going to vote for that guy. And I think you'll see that happen. But the right leaders have to come along.
It's as simple as a bumper sticker that says, I'm not an asshole. Vote for me.
Yeah.
I would vote for that person.
Yeah.
If they could point out that they're not an asshole, I'm down.
Yeah. The Wall Street Journal had a great article a couple weeks ago saying that the Democratic Party had to pivot to finding Bill Clinton type candidates again.
Yeah.
And that was the gift that Bill Clinton had, is that Bill Clinton had that ability to go into rural areas in Missouri, where he won twice, and speak to them, and they felt him. They felt his words, that he understood what they were going through. And that's why they continued to vote for him. And that's why you had a ton of growth, while he was in office. People just believed in it.
Yeah.
We can have that again.
Do you see a blue wave in 2 years?
Oh, you're definitely going to have that happen. I would be absolutely shocked. It's not necessarily where it's like a blue wave or a red wave. When you look back over the last 100 years,
a retraction.
Yeah, you always have the rubber band expand really far out in one direction, whether it be left or right, and then people then see the policies that they put forth, and they're like, "Whoa, that's a little too much." And then you see it start to move back towards the center where we have a more balanced government.
Sure.
And when you look at every study under the sun has shown that our economy is actually its most effective when we have a divided Congress, versus one where all the parties are the same. And so I think historically speaking, the likelihood of the Republicans being able to hold on to both houses with the slim majorities that they have in 2026, I wouldn't bet for it. I don't think it's going to happen.
Yeah. Do you find it funny, though, that anymore that there is no longer a party to be found that is fiscally conservative?
I think it's embarrassing. But once again, I think that every now and then you have candidates that come along that preach deficit reduction and they actually follow through on what they are saying. And the Wall Street Journal had an excellent article about a week ago that profiled the presidents going back to Ronald Reagan, and it analyzed their economy, and it looked at treasuries and S&P returns and all this stuff. Bill Clinton by far was the best one.
Yeah.
By far was the best one.
Yeah.
And he was the only president that actually focused on deficit reduction. And when we had deficit reduction, the 10-year treasury went down, the interest rates went down, the stock market took off, we had a budget surplus. We were better off as a country fiscally.
Well, there's another study, I don't remember where I read it. I think it might have been The Atlantic, I believe, where they also put an overlap of quality of life, where you take this metric of historic quality of life polls. And during the 90s, when we had a balanced budget, when NAFTA was working, when all those things were occurring, quality of life, 80% are happy with their lives. We haven't been there since. Not even close.
Well, and we continue to put our self-interest ahead of the national interest, meaning, post Bill Clinton, we fight 2 wars. One of them, the country wasn't even responsible in Iraq. It was a preemptive war. And while we're fighting these 2 wars and spending billions of dollars a year, we do the dumbest thing in the world and we pass tax cuts, which no president in history had ever done that, where they're fighting a war and they're passing tax cuts at the same time.
One of them votes.
Which then drives us into a great recession. And then, we ask a amazing order from Illinois to help bail us out, and so he does that. And then what do we do again? We fall right back into tax cuts again, which are driving up our debt. And then we have COVID, which further piled on that debt. And eventually we're going to have a heart attack moment where it hits and people realize that we have to have higher taxes to pay down our deficit and get our fiscal house in order, because nobody could run a business this way. We couldn't do it. We'd be bankrupt 100 times over.
That saying right there, I lay in bed at night staring at the ceiling, like wondering how the fuck do we continue to do this when there is not a small business, mid-sized business, Fortune 500, I don't care who it is. Every business in America, in the world for that matter, when you evaluate leadership and you evaluate decision-making process, the process you take is one of efficiency. Let's increase efficiency. Let's increase production. Let's do all those things. We do not do that from a political level. We have not recently. We don't hold leadership accountable, the way that we hold every other institution accountable in our societies.
Well, I think we eventually, when it gets bad enough, we eventually hold them responsible, and we vote in, new leaders to help correct it. I think our problem is that we look at finances from a short-term perspective.
Sure.
What are you giving me now? How rich can I become quickly?
I want my eggs to be cheaper.
I don't want, if I can work less and gain even more money, so be it.
Yeah.
But it's not the focus on the long term. And because of that, we're addicted to tax cuts. We're addicted to not being fiscally responsible. And when it does finally hit the fan, and I promise you it will, because that's the thing. History doesn't repeat, it rhymes. Human behavior repeats constantly.
Well, earlier in our conversation, I pointed out the reality of the bottom 10, top 10 as it pertains to education and other things when we look at red and blue states, right? We already have seen the shit hit the fan, per se, in many of the red states that I was overlapping in that conversation earlier. Look at Mississippi, look at Louisiana. They've had fiscal disasters because of some of the mantras and the ideology that they've applied in this anything anti-socialist landscape that they live in.
Well, a perfect example of this is Kansas. So Kansas, less than 10 years ago, had this governor come into office named Brownback, okay?
Yeah, I remember.
And Brownback pushed through this idea that he ran on, which is let's get rid of our state income tax, okay? But he put the cart before the horse. He got rid of the state income tax, but he didn't think of, hey, what kind of revenue do I have coming in that's going to make up for the shortfall? Mm-hmm. And so they passed the tax cuts. They then have a massive budget deficit. And under their state constitution, they have to balance their budget.
Right.
And so now they have to start cutting things. And one of the things that they tried to cut was education funding. Well, the state constitution doesn't allow that. And their Supreme Court slammed them on it. And so what did they have to do? They had to raise taxes on businesses that weren't even expecting it. And so they saw these massive tax increases. And then what do? They vote all those guys out and they vote in a Republican legislator turned Democrat. And now she's currently running that state as a Democrat governor.
Yeah.
And so eventually it will hit when you are being fiscally irresponsible. The cows will come home. They will. They always do.
And they raise minimum wages and they passed abortion rights and they it's the same thing. They do the same thing Missouri does. When you put liberal ideology or liberal policies on the ballot, these red states time and time again vote for those things.
Well, I think those things, though, touch on as well people in those states, and I think states in general, they don't want government telling them what to do all the time and getting involved in their lives, especially with personal decisions.
Right.
Even in the bedroom, they don't want that. So I don't think it's a red state or a blue state issue. I think it's just a common sense. I live in democracy, and, stay out of my life, as much as possible. Let me have at least some free reign in my life, and if you're going to try to infringe on that, then I'm going to vote for whatever I have to vote for to make sure you can't do it.
So in summary, what you're saying is make people smarter, don't be an asshole, and let the market do its thing.
Exactly.
Am I close?
Exactly.
Is that the trifecta?
That is the trifecta, yeah.
Well, in Missouri, you can vote on that or gamble on that now.
We can.
I'm sure I can find the parlay somewhere.
Bet on it.
Jarrad, this has been a lot of fun, man. This is the rabbit hole that I was hoping that we would go down. Thanks for joining me for this No Guardrail chat.
Thank you, JB.
Hey, man. I will talk to you soon. I will see you on LinkedIn, and I will keep it up. Jarrad Holst, Holst.
Yes.
There you go. If you're listening, go give him a follow. You'll learn all about how much fentanyl costs and other things. Take care. Thank you.